Welcome to key issue 2 of chapter 10. Why do people consume different foods? Now, we could probably think of a lot of reasons people consume different foods. There may be food taboos in certain cultures, as we've studied before. People just have different personal preference, of course. But in this chapter and in this key issue, we're really looking at why people consume different foods based on their location and based on their country's level of development, how much money they have, to put it more plainly. We're going to look now at diet. Now, a lot of people talk about going on a diet, but really we're all already on diets. Diet is just what you eat. It's just reference to what certain people or animals eat. Dietary energy consumption is the amount of food that an individual consumes. Consumption of food varies around the world, both in total amount and source of nutrients, for two reasons. Level of development. So your level of development is going to impact the kind of agricultural practices you have, the kind of access you have to food from other places. You know, a rich country like the United States, we can get food from all over. Even in wintertime, we can get fresh fruits and vegetables because they're being shipped from Mexico or South America. And level of development also impacts the kind of farming technology that you have, which is going to dictate how much food you can produce, and of course, how much food people get to eat. Physical conditions also play a critical role here because different environments are suitable to growing different types of food. Some environments are not at all suitable to growing foods. You know, if you live in the desert, the physical conditions of the place in which you reside are going to have a huge impact on how much food you have, and especially what kind of food you have. This map shows us the leading food energy source consumed by people in different countries and different regions. We see that in North America as well as most of Europe, parts of North Africa, most of North Africa, and a large part of the Middle East as well, I should say the majority, consume wheat. So wheat is what we use to make flour, to make bread, crackers, all kind of things that have gluten. Ooh. Some people can't eat gluten. Some people have a true gluten intolerance. It's become somewhat fashionable recently to avoid wheat for whatever reason. But people have been consuming wheat for thousands of years. And that's why it has such a large holding in our calorie consumption in these regions. But we also see in Asia, as this should be no surprise, that rice is the dominant energy source. Food is energy, right? When we consume food, our bodies burn it and produce energy to keep our bodies going. There are some places here that we have no data, but I want to point out a couple other things. One, maize. Maize is, as you probably already know, corn. And corn, we know, is a huge part of the diet in Central and South America. I should say mostly Central America, parts of South America, but also, surprisingly to a lot of people, a big part of Africa. Now, the other main indicator of, or main source of people's food right here is here in Central Africa, and it says other. Now, what does that mean? Well, it could be all kinds of things. People don't necessarily eat just one thing, but a lot of people eat different types of roots and tubers that they often mash up into some kind of pulp and then make a food with that. You see that throughout Central Africa. Developed and developing regions typically differ most in their primary sources of protein consumed. In developed countries, the leading source of protein is meat. The three biggest ones would be beef, pork, and poultry, which is chicken. Of course, poultry is pretty hard to find right now because of COVID-19. Everybody's stocking up. Developing countries usually rely on cereal grains for protein, followed by legumes, beans, it comes as a surprise to many people that you can get protein, you can get sufficient protein from food other than meat. But people love meat, and here's where the issue lies. Because notice these are called developing countries, not undeveloped countries. They're called developing countries because they are on their way to development. Year after year, even though there are still major problems in the developing world, people gain more money. Not in every country, and certainly not at the same rate between all of the countries. But more and more people are moving up into a later stage of development. That means their country is getting more infrastructure, more energy access, more technology, more food for everybody, bigger economies, and that means more money. What are people going to do with that money? A lot of them are going to start buying meat. Meat is kind of a luxury if you think about it. We take it for granted in this country because we just go to the supermarket and it's all wrapped up and everything, and it's really relatively cheap. But meat is a luxury. And so as people in the developing world get more money, they're going to consume more meat, and that's great for them. It's kind of a problem for the globe, or it could be, because meat is already having an impact on climate change. It turns out meat is really not the most efficient food source. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the amount of energy that's used to produce meat for you and I to consume is a lot more than the amount of energy that might be used to produce non-meat foods. For example, if I want to eat a hamburger, which I often want to, I don't have them that often, but I often want to eat a hamburger, I have to get some beef, okay? That beef comes from a cow. Where did that cow come from? Well, it didn't come from nowhere. That cow had to be born and raised, and it had to be fed all the while it was getting big enough to be slaughtered. What were they feeding it? Well, maybe we'll say we're feeding it some grains, okay? Grains are okay. You and I can eat grains. We eat grains in lots of different ways. We eat cereal grains. We can make lots of good stuff. Now, if I were to just eat those grains right as they were ready to be harvested from the earth, then that'd be a pretty good, efficient form of energy. I'd get protein from it. I would get plenty of energy from it. But instead, what do? We feed it to cows for years and years and years, or not years and years, but for the lifespan of that cow. We feed it to them, and then all the energy that also has to go into slaughtering the cow, processing the meat, shipping it, pumping in water for the cows to drink. All that stuff you could see as kind of a waste, okay? Now, I don't necessarily see it as a waste because I do eat meat. Some of you don't. But if really all we're concerned about is the most efficient way to produce food, then meat doesn't quite cut it. Now, meat does have some really good health benefits, to be sure, and that needs to be included in the conversation. But as more and more people are consuming meat, that's going to be a bigger strain on resources. Resources like energy, like fertilizer, like land, because you have to have all this land to grow all this food that isn't even going to be eaten by humans, but it's going to be eaten by animals. So it's something to consider. This map shows us the leading protein source in different regions as a percentage. And this shows us the percent of protein obtained from meat in different regions. You could also look at this in some ways as a map of development, right? Because the more developed countries are going to get more of their protein from meat, the less developed are going to get it from other sources. We'll look at some words related to nutrition and hunger. Undernourishment is dietary energy consumption that's continuously below the minimum requirement. for maintaining a healthy life and carrying out light physical activity. Meaning, if you're not getting enough dietary energy, enough calories, then you are going to be in a state of undernourishment. You're not going to, your body might continue to function for some time, but it's going to be functioning at a lower level. It's going to be degraded by this, okay? This is true hunger. But hunger is kind of a broad term because you and I have felt hunger before. Hopefully you haven't felt starvation. Hunger is the distress associated with the lack of food. Okay, we've all experienced this. Usually by about third period, if you're in my room. The threshold for food deprivation or undernourishment is fewer than 1,800 calories per day. So your book says kilocalories. It's not exactly the same thing, but it is the same thing. That's really all I'm going to say on that because for the most part, people just ignore the term kilocalories. When you see the word calories, it's really referring to kilocalories. But 1,800, that's about how much people need every day. Now, you might get less one day and more the next day, but on average, people need about that much. And of course, it does depend on the size of the person, right? If you're a 300-pound football player, you're probably going to need more than a ballerina. But it is important that people get enough caloric intake. But we can go beyond that because the term undernutrition signifies deficiencies in energy, protein, and/or essential vitamins and minerals. I might eat white rice for a month and have plenty of it and get 1,800 calories a day, but I will probably still be undernourished in some way. I'm not going to get the protein I need. I'm not going to get the vitamins and minerals that I likely need to continue to be healthy. Malnutrition refers more broadly to both undernutrition and overnutrition. So this is what gives us problems with unbalanced diets, and we see this in the developed world where people have all the food they could possibly want. Yes, even during an epidemic, people think all the food's going to disappear. Guess what? It keeps coming in on trucks. We have such an abundance of food that could actually lead, and does lead, to malnutrition in some ways. How? Well, if you get too much of one nutrient and not enough of another one, right? So obesity definitely comes to mind. But this is not just resulting in obesity. Some people just don't have very good diets, and you could refer to that as malnutrition. Food security relates to food availability, access, and utilization. When a person always has adequate availability and access to enough safe and nutritious food to maintain an active and healthy life, they are considered food secure. So we find food security issues all over the world, including in wealthy countries like the United States. There are people, even in Memphis, in certain zip codes, who are considered food insecure. Now, what does that mean beyond this definition? It just means that they don't have regular access to nutritious food to maintain an active and healthy life. They might have enough calories to keep their body going, but if those calories are coming from the corner store, from 3 honey buns and some chips, then they could still be considered food insecure. And that's because we have something called food deserts. A food desert is just a region where people live. It could be a region within a city, it could be a neighborhood, where they don't have access to healthy food because there's no grocery stores there. In fact, the Guardian did an interesting video, I'll link it to you, about food deserts in Memphis, because you might live in one part of the city like I do, where you could go on a 30-minute run and pass 5 grocery stores, or you might live in another zip code like Orange Mound, where there's no grocery stores around. And so food deserts are a big part of food insecurity. But when we look at less developed countries, food insecurity is not just economic, but it's environmental. So if you live in a literal desert, you're not able to grow much food. Maybe you live in just a semi-arid environment. You're able to do agriculture, but not very well, and you're really reliant on rainfall, and if that rain does not come, then you will not be producing as much food. So it's just not having access to enough nutritious food. So here we have some facts from the United Nations on hunger. The United Nations had these Millennium Development Goals that they created, and one of the goals is to address hunger. So they've rolled out all these facts on them, and I think it's significant enough for us to be aware of. According to the UN, an estimated 821 million people were undernourished in 2017. And your book says something similar to this, but your book is not as updated as these facts. The majority of the world's hungry people live in developing countries, where 12.9% of the population is undernourished. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the region with the highest prevalence of hunger, with the rate increasing from 20.7% in 2014 to 23.2% in 2017. Hold on. Our book showed us that we've gotten better and better at agriculture, right? We have better technology. We have better seeds that are more drought resistant. We have better farming practices that allow us to produce higher yields in a smaller area of land. So how are we seeing hunger increase from 2014 to 2017? What do you think? That's right. Little Blue's Clues for you. The increase is probably due to population increase, not necessarily people getting worse at agriculture. Though we do have to keep in mind all those gains in efficiency in agriculture aren't spread out evenly. Right? In North America, we seem to get better and better every year at producing food. We have technology, we have the ability to share that technology, we have energy to power that technology, we have irrigation, we have all these advantages that developing countries, farmers in developing countries, don't necessarily have, right? So we might not actually be seeing an increase in productivity there, but we do know we're seeing an increase in population. That's more mouths to feed. And so if we can't push that efficiency further than the population growth, we're going to continue to see hunger. In sub-Saharan Africa, the number of undernourished people increased from 195 million in 2014 to 237 million in 2017. So this is just the raw numbers for us. Poor nutrition causes nearly half of deaths in children under 5, 3.1 million children each year. 149 million children under 5 years of age. That's 22% of the global under 5 population. We're still chronically undernourished in 2018. So again, chronically undernourished might not mean that you're going to starve to death the next day, but it's going to have a major impact on how your body functions, your strength, your overall quality of life, and as we see here, sadly, can result in death. Let's talk a little bit about food security globally. Agriculture is the single largest employer in the world, providing livelihoods for 40% of today's global population. It is the largest source of income and jobs for poor rural households. Now this might come as a great shock to you. I think it would to a lot of people. 40% of the world's population are involved in agriculture. How many people do you know that are farmers? I don't mean they have a garden in their backyard. I mean that's their job. Probably not many. And that's because you live in a developed country. In the United States, it's usually not more than 2% of the population who are directly involved in agriculture. Now, there's a lot of people involved in agribusiness and the whole system of getting that food from the farm to your plate, whether it's grocery stores or restaurants or trucking or food processing. We have a lot of jobs in that, but directly in agriculture, farming, very small amount. Why is that? Because we have technology, because we're so efficient at agriculture, it doesn't take that many people to produce a lot of food. That's not the case in much of the developing world, and we have to keep that in mind. And so if agriculture is the largest employer in the world, if agriculture techniques are not progressing, then those people's livelihoods are not progressing. 500 million small farms worldwide, most still rain-fed, meaning they don't use irrigation, they don't have access to water they can pump out of the ground whenever they want. They have to wait for the rain. Provide up to 80% of food consumed in a large part of the developing world. Investing in smallholder women and men is an important way to increase food security and nutrition for the poorest, as well as food production for local and global markets. What is this about? Well, a lot of rich countries do pour money into poor countries. It's called aid. And a lot of times, though, that goes to large companies there. And so what the UN is saying is that if we have all these small farms, if we're not investing in those people, those smallholder farms, then we're really missing a big opportunity. Since the 1900s, some 75% of crop diversity has been lost from farmers' fields. Better use of agricultural biodiversity can contribute to more nutritious diets, enhance livelihoods for farming communities, and more resilient and sustainable farming systems. This one's a little bit controversial, but I don't have any reason to disagree with it. What does it mean when it says crop diversity has been lost? That just means that on a given farm, we're seeing less and less variety in the type of food that's grown. Think about if you had your own farm several hundred years ago. Whatever you eat is going to come from that farm. And so you're going to want to grow lots of stuff because you want to eat different things. You don't want to just eat porridge all day, every day. It sounds miserable. Over time, we've seen those farms get less and less diverse, where people are focusing just on 1 or 2 or 3 crops. That's how things are in the United States on many farms. I don't know if it's the majority. I would assume it's the majority. But you've probably witnessed this. You've driven across country or you're driving through a rural area and you see a big farm. It's just got one thing, right? Maybe it's cotton, maybe it's soybeans, maybe it's corn. They focus on one thing. Why? Because they can get really good at that one thing and they can maximize their efficiency. Now, what are the problems with this? Well, one of the problems with a monoculture, just growing one crop, is that it depletes nutrients from the soil over time. If you're not engaging in something called crop rotation, then you're not allowing the land to kind of recover from growing that one crop. Crop rotation is when you plant one thing one year and then probably the next year, the next season, you'll plant something else. Maybe even a third thing the next season. What that does is it allows nutrients to go back into the soil because crop A might require this nutrient, but crop B would require that nutrient. And if you're only planting crop A year after year after year, that soil is going to get burnt up. It's going to essentially be worthless after a time. Now, how do we deal with that in the developed world? where we have lots of farms that just do one thing. Fertilizer. We replenish the soil with nutrients, not so much in a natural way, but with science. What the UN is concerned about is farms, especially in the developing world, that are doing this, and yet they might not have access to fertilizers to help their plants grow. And those fertilizers also have some people concerned about their impact on the environment. And so the idea is to create more crop diversity. More diverse farms also are more resilient. That means they're more likely to survive. Why? Well, if I just have one crop and this beetle comes along that loves that crop, it could wipe out my whole crop, and I wouldn't have any money, I wouldn't have any food, and so that's not very secure. If I have multiple crops, maybe if it wipes out one of them, but it doesn't like the other ones, then that's a good situation. That's not a good situation, but it's a better situation. Anybody know what this is? This is a cocoa pod. Actually, that's a human being, but he's holding a cocoa pod, and he's probably a cocoa farmer. Cocoa, which is used, of course, to make chocolate, can only be grown at certain latitudes around the equator, and that's why, or I should say, only grown well, and that's why so much of the cocoa farming that occurs is in Africa. And it's an example of a monoculture, right? Just growing one thing and one thing only. And we see that in what are called plantations. Plantation agriculture, of course, might make you think of the Deep South and slavery. And it's true, those were plantations, especially because they focused on one cash crop, a crop that you could grow and sell instead of necessarily eating. But we see plantations throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia, where it's a big farm that's usually owned by a bigger company or an outside company, and people on it produce the food that's then shipped to other countries. That's usually what a plantation farm is. That's not necessarily what this is. I don't know where this guy is. I just pulled this picture from the internet. But if you look up on YouTube this video from the Ivory Coast, and I think it's called Cocoa Farmers Taste Chocolate for the First Time, you'll be pretty amazed by the video. If you search for that, you should find it. It might not be called that exactly, but it gets at the reality that a lot of these farmers haven't even tasted chocolate, because there's a whole process involved in turning those cocoa beans into edible chocolate. But this is an example of a farming practice that really doesn't produce much wealth for the farmer, but can produce a lot of wealth for outside companies like Nestle that might buy up the cocoa beans. Another example of a monoculture, not to be confused with cocoa, is the coca plant, and this is used to make the drug cocaine. And we see this grown in Central and South America, a lot. Majoritively is what I almost said. That's not a word that I know of. Mainly would work. This is mainly grown in Central and South America. And I included this example because it's another example of a lack of crop diversity. Why? Because the farmers can just get so much more money from this than growing anything else. Back in I think it was the 80s, the United States government, trying to curb the crack epidemic, actually tried to pay farmers in places like Colombia to grow anything other than coca leaves. to grow bananas, for instance. And even though it's illegal, people still, in many countries, people still do it because they can just get a lot more money and it's easier to grow than other crops. And with the way food is distributed today, it's not necessarily that hard to buy food from another farmer, and might be easier to just grow whatever can get you the most money. So that's another example of a cash crop. More facts on food security, and then we'll wrap up. If women farmers had the same access to resources as men, the number of hungry in the world could be reduced by up to 150 million. So unfortunately, because of gender inequality, women farmers don't always have access to loans from the bank in order to get farming implements or buy land, whatever they need to do agriculture. They don't always have access to anything that might be needed for agriculture. And so one of the ways to kind of move the needle on this, similarly to changing or slowing down population growth, is just ensuring that women have the same rights as men. 840 million people have no access to electricity worldwide, most of whom live in rural areas of the developing world. Energy poverty in many regions is a fundamental barrier to reducing hunger and ensuring that the world can produce enough food to meet future demand. So again, irrigation. Irrigation is nothing new. The ancient Romans used irrigation to increase their crop yields. In fact, you can travel around Italy and other parts of Europe. I was in France and saw a lot of the old aqueducts that the Roman Empire set up. This is critical to having steady food supply, and yet you can't always rely on ancient aqueducts, and so people usually pump water from the ground. Now, of course, to pump water out of a well or to move water from another region, you have to have some form of energy. And if your country does not have energy, does not have electricity, you're just going to have to wait on the rain. So this shows percent of undernourishment in different parts of the world, different countries. We see it's actually very high in South Asia as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And this shows us it in the form of a map. Feel free to pause here and look at this. And lastly, the change over time of undernourishment from 91 to 2011. We've seen the greatest rise in South Asia, and that's probably due to population increase, the rapid boom that we saw in India. All right, that will do it for this lecture. The next lecture is Key Issue 3, which is in 2 parts, and then Key Issue 4 to wrap it up.